Hey there, this is the Casual Fan, and welcome to the driver ratings for the Austrian Grand Prix. Now, a lot of things happened in that race. We had the track limits fiasco, we had the sprint weekend, but yes, again, we had Max Verstappen winning the race, the sprint race, securing pole position, the fastest lap, pretty much everything that was on offer. So, yes, overall, the Red Bull domination continues. In this video, what we are going to do is we are going to take a look at the driver ratings for the Austrian GP weekend. We're going to go through each of these drivers and see how each of them fared during the weekend. So without further ado, let's get straight to it. Let's start with Red Bull, and first of all, let's take a look at Max Verstappen. Now, talking about Max, I think this was another weekend where he showed how much of a difference a driver makes. Another weekend where his teammate made a mistake, ended up qualifying outside of top 10 once again. And again, he showed that there are these potholes that a driver could fall in, even if he has a competitive car under him. Yet, Max Verstappen does not make a mistake. I think that is his hallmark, to be honest. It's not just the fact that he drives at a very high level, it's also the fact that he is very consistent when it comes to doing that. He hardly has any day off, and that is where he makes a difference. Another weekend where there was possibly an opportunity for him missing out because of the track limits thing, or even on Saturday when it was a wet race, he could have easily made a mistake. It was on the table, yet he did not. And ultimately, if you have to look at the entire weekend, it was a faultless weekend from him once again. And if I have to give a driver rating, he gets a rating of 10 out of 10, because I don't think how I can deduct a point after a driver produces such kind of a weekend where he gets maximum points in the race, in the sprint, and then even gets the fastest lap as well. So yeah, in my view, he gets a rating of 10 out of 10 for the Austrian Grand Prix. Next up, we have Sergio Perez. And in my view, Sergio Perez, I think the weekend will prove to be a confidence booster for him, because he needed a result. He needed to get back on the podium, and he was able to achieve that this weekend. Now, once again, his qualifying was poor. It should not be this way. The way Perez is actually complicating matters for himself in the last few races. It should not happen. But yes, at least he got the result under him. So yes, overall a strong weekend, a P2 and P3 in sprint and the race. But yes, not a perfect one in my view. And if a driver is ultimately getting knocked out in Q2, despite having a car that is capable of securing pole position, he will be docked points. So yes, in my view, when it comes to the Austrian Grand Prix, he gets a rating of 7 out of 10. Now let's move to Ferrari, and first of all, let's talk about Charles Leclerc. Now, talking about Charles, one thing that stood out was the qualifying lap on Friday. He was on the edge, and it was obvious to see that that was a particular lap where he pushed to the limit and tried to secure whatever he could from the car. He fell a 10th shot from Max to get the pole position, but I don't think it would have made much of a difference ultimately in the final result. Now he secured a P2 in the race. That was good. But what is obvious is that Charles is not quite comfortable in the car right now. In terms of pace, it's a surprise, but Sainz is arguably able to extract more from the car as compared to Charles at this stage. Having said that, a P2 result, 18 points from a race weekend, is probably the best that he could have done. And yeah, he gets a rating of 8.5 out of 10. He does not get anything more than that because of the kind of sprint Saturday that he had, where he wasn't really able to do much as compared to Carlos. Next up, we have Carlos Sainz, and well, in terms of being the benchmark at Ferrari, I think Carlos is the one who's doing that right now. He's arguably more comfortable with the car. He's getting the better performance, a better lap time, and I think that showed during the sprint as well, where he was able to secure a P3. Now, what did not work for Carlos was, well, first of all, he got a bit emotional. He got a bit his team radios where he said Sergio Perez was intimidating him. It was a bit funny. Overall, there were a few unforced errors that basically cost him a bit in terms of not only lap time but his final finish. A P6 result is just not what you would expect from Carlos after the kind of weekend that he had. And that is why, in terms of driver ratings, he gets a 7.5 out of 10. Next up, let's take a look at Mercedes, and first of all, let's take a look at Lewis Hamilton. Now, talking about Lewis, what a symbolic weekend from him. First, on Saturday, there was potential of more points. He could not achieve it. Somewhere down the line, he has to take the blame for what happened in qualifying as well on Saturday. Then, talking about the race, there were far too many complaints, far too many team radios, and yes, that team radio from Toto Wolff, it was a bit interesting to see how that thing ultimately unravels in the future. Overall, what was obvious was that Lewis was clearly the faster Mercedes driver this weekend. However, if you look at the points accrued by both the drivers, you'd be surprised to see that actually George outscored Lewis this weekend. And that is why, in terms of rating, he gets a rating of 5 out of 10 for the Austrian Grand Prix. Next up, let's talk about George Russell. And overall, a bit of an off weekend from him. He was not on Lewis's pace at any point during the weekend. That call in the sprint to move to slick tires was an inspired choice. It helped him secure a point. Overall, though, he needs to work on extracting more performance from the car, especially in qualifying. Overall, if I have to give a rating to George, he gets a rating of 6 out of 10 for the kind of weekend that he had. Next up, we have Alpine, and first of all, let's take a look at Esteban Ocon. Now, talking about Esteban Ocon, it was a weekend of two halves. In the sprint part of the weekend, it was a very impressive show from him, because not only did he qualify well for the sprint, even in the race in wet weather conditions which were tricky, and in a situation where he had faster cars like Charles Leclerc and Lando Norris behind him, he was able to fend them off and ultimately secure two crucial points. And even in the end, he was able to hold off George Russell as well. So yes, you take those things into consideration, a very strong Saturday. Now, when you move to Sunday, you have a 30-second penalty. Well, that I won't really blame him for this, because he did not get warned beforehand by the stewards. Of course, many people miss that, but that is the bottom line. If you're not informed by the stewards that you're doing something wrong, sometimes it's hard to keep a track on things like this. Even if you keep that aside, the race was not as impressive. He did not have the pace of his teammate Pierre Gasly, who actually secured a point. So yes, not the best weekend from him. But yes, again, 2 points for Alpine from Ocon this time around. In terms of rating, he gets a rating of 7.5 out of 10, primarily because of the kind of driving that he showed in the sprint, and because he ultimately ended up outscoring Gasly this weekend, even though he was not on par with him in terms of performance. Next up, let's talk about Pierre Gasly, and in terms of performance, he was very impressive in the race, but in the sprint part, he was not able to showcase the kind of performance that he had. He secured a point. Even he lost out a position because of the 10-second penalty. But yes, overall, a weekend where he would feel a bit positive, because he was able to show the kind of performance that matches or is even better than Ocon in the race. But overall, maybe a bit disappointed because the points were just not there. So yeah, in terms of rating, he gets a rating of 7 out of 10 for the Austrian Grand Prix. Next up, let's take a look at McLaren, and first of all, let's talk about Lando Norris. Now, talking about Lando, if you take a look at the weekend overall, it was amazing. That overtake on Lewis Hamilton, that speaks a lot about the kind of performance he was able to extract from the McLaren, and the kind of performance and confidence McLaren was able to give to him. So yes, that was something that stood out, at least for me. However, while his race was spectacular, there's no doubt about it, his sprint was poor. Getting into anti-stall on the very first lap, it cost him positions and ultimately it cost him points. Not the best part, to be honest. However, if we take a look at the overall weekend, you have to sit back and be impressed with the kind of performance Lando put together. He essentially buried his teammate, Oscar Piastri, someone who has been pretty impressive in my view. But yes, this weekend was all about Lando and the kind of performance that he put together. And yes, it's not only about the upgrades, it's about the driver as well. You cannot have such a huge divergence in terms of performance between the two drivers only because of upgrades. This was the driver making a difference, and he needs to be commended for that. So yes, in terms of driver ratings, he gets a rating of 8.5 out of 10 for the Austrian Grand Prix. Now let's talk about Oscar Piastri, and well, he got dominated by Lando Norris this weekend. And yes, it should be a weekend that proves to be probably a rude wake-up call for him, because this was the first time that McLaren made a step and he wasn't able to keep up, while Lando just took off. The kind of gap the two drivers have in terms of results and in terms of performance during the entire Austrian GP weekend, it was a bit alarming. And for a driver of Piastri's caliber and someone who has shown that he can somewhat keep up with Norris, this should be a learning experience. Let's see how he bounces back in Silverstone. Overall though, this weekend he gets a rating of 4 out of 10, because honestly he was just buried by Lando this time around. Next up we have Alfa Romeo, and first of all let's talk about Valtteri Bottas. Now talking about Bottas, to be honest, it was a bit of an anonymous weekend. thing is, you can't really blame him that much because the car performance is just not there. However, if you look at his competitive performances with Joe Guan Yu in the other car, there's really not much to choose. It's not like Bottas is making the kind of difference that an experienced driver should. So yes, something to look forward, something to keep an eye on, because Audi is coming in next season and they will be keeping an eye on the kind of performance their drivers are able to produce. For now, the Alfa Romeo driver lineup is probably the most uninspiring lineup in the entire grid. So yes, something to keep an eye on, and something to see what happens next with Bottas. In terms of rating, this weekend he gets a rating of 5.5 out of 10, because I honestly couldn't even notice if he was there in the race. That's the level of anonymity that is there for Alfa Romeo drivers right now. Next up, we have Guan Yu Zhou, and in terms of the verdict over the entire weekend, there's not much to say. It's pretty much similar to what happens with Bottas. The kind of performance the two drivers are producing is somewhat similar. At the end of the day, neither are shining and neither are really showcasing the kind of brilliance that a team that is going to be in Audi in the future can truly be inspired by. So yes, overall an okayish weekend maybe. In terms of rating, he gets a rating of 5.5 out of 10, because there's not much to talk about, to be honest. Next up, we have Fernando Alonso, and in my view, not the best of weekends from him. He was still able to secure a decent result in both sprint as well as the main race on Sunday. But if I have to look at the performance part of it, I felt Alonso was not entirely comfortable with the car he had under him. In the sprint, he was even beaten by Lance Stroll. Now, there are many that allege that he probably didn't try as hard. I don't know, I'm not going to make a comment on that. But yes, overall, if I look at his entire weekend, it was not the vintage Fernando Alonso weekends. And yeah, because of that, he gets a rating of 7.5 out of 10 for the Austrian Grand Prix. Next up, we have Lance Stroll, and overall, if you look at the entire weekend in terms of performance, Stroll was there and thereabouts. He even beat Alonso in the sprint, just by a tiny margin, but he still was able to get that done. The race was not as impressive, and he should not be he should not be losing places like this in a race, especially in an Aston Martin. But yeah, overall, if I have to give a rating, he gets a rating of 7 out of 10, because at least in terms of performance, he was there and thereabouts with Alonso. Next up, we have Haas. And first of all, let's talk about Kevin Magnussen. Now, talking about Kevin, well, he was a bit listless in qualifying. Pretty poor, to be honest, if you compare it with his teammate. The race was, well, you can't really make much of an impact in a Haas in a race because the tires don't last more than a couple of laps. Overall, I think we might be reaching a point where the Magnussen's seat might be in danger, because the way Hülkenberg is performing, it raises a lot of questions of how good Magnussen is, and the level at which he's performing right now, it's just not up to the mark. So yeah, in terms of rating, he gets a rating of 4 out of 10 for the Austrian GP, because it was not a weekend that he'll look back and be proud of in any which way. Now let's talk about Nico Hülkenberg, and now in my view, others might disagree. I feel he's overachieving in that Haas. The kind of qualifying performances that he's putting together, I don't think there are many drivers on the grid that would be able to do that. A P3 and P4, his last 3 qualifying results have been a P2 in Canada, a P4 start in Austria, and a P6 start as well in the race. So when you take a look at that and ultimately bring context into these results, that he's doing it in a Haas, especially when his teammate is not even able to make it into the top 10, that's very impressive. And yeah, he was able to scrape through into points, and also one of the drivers who was able to make an inspired call on slicks in the sprint race and get a few points under his belt. Other than that, the races, it was expected what was going to happen. The car cannot keep its tires alive in any which way. So yeah, overall, if I look at his weekend, he was spectacular in qualifying, pretty amazing in the sprint, and finally in the race, he was pretty helpless. He couldn't really do anything with the car. So yeah, in terms of rating, he gets a rating of 9 out of 10 for the Austrian Grand Prix weekend. Next up, we have Yuki Tsunoda, and not the best of weekends for him. He made a bit of an ambitious lunch at the start of the race on Sunday. Didn't really turn out favorably for him. Overall, it does appear that with the AlphaTauri not improving much, Tsunoda is kind of limited with what he can do with that car. And yeah, not the best of weekends. He made a mistake here and there, couldn't really extract much, ended up finishing quite low in the race as well. So yeah, in terms of rating, he gets a rating of 5 out of 10 for the Austrian Grand Prix. Now talking about Nick De Vries, and yeah, the kind of improvements that are expected of him, he is not really able to show that. I just feel that the end might be near for him. If the reports are true and Red Bull is looking to replace him, we might see Liam Lawson get an opportunity. There is also another scenario with Daniel Ricciardo that might emerge. We don't know yet if that could happen, but for now, yeah, not the best of weekends, not the kind of improvements that would help him secure his seat. So yeah, in terms of rating, he gets a rating of 5 out of 10 for the Austrian Grand Prix. Next up, we have Williams, and first of all, let's take a look at Alex Albon. Now, talking about Alex, that was a very impressive weekend. He almost secured points in both the races and was just a little unlucky. Maybe a DNF here and there, and he could have sneaked through. But yes, still he's showing the kind of performance that he can pull through in a competitive car. And yes, again, much better than Logan. Overall, he gets a rating of 8 out of 10 for the weekend in Austria. Finally, talking about Logan Sargent, and at least he didn't crash. That was one of the positives. He was closer to Albon, not massively, but yes, still there was still incremental growth. However, I will be keeping an eye on the weekend in Silverstone. He tends to do well there. Let's see how he performs, because if he's able to out-qualify or even beat Alex Albon at Silverstone, we might see a change in momentum. If that happens, he might be able to secure his seat at Williams. If that doesn't, his seat might be in trouble. So yeah, when it comes to Austria, he gets a rating of 6 out of 10 for the weekend that he had. So now, since we've gone through the driver ratings for each and every driver, let's take a look at the cumulative driver rankings after the first 9 races. Now this is where quite a few are going to be surprised, because okay, Max Verstappen on top, expected. Fernando Alonso in P2, again expected. At P3 we have Esteban Ocon. Now there are many that would not be entirely on board with this kind of a outcome or a ranking. I'm sure there are quite a few that are going to question how Esteban Ocon is there. Well, we'll get to that. Again, going down the order, we have Lewis at P4. He dropped a place because of the kind of weekend that he had in Austria. Russell is in P5. Yuki Tsunoda is in P6. He's slowly dropping down the order as well. Charles Leclerc in P7, Lando Norris in P8, another one somewhat expected. Alex Albon in P9 and Nico Hülkenberg in P10. So this is the top 10 that we have. Now in this top 10, I think the rankings of Ocon and Tsunoda is probably going to surprise a few people. However, we'll get to that later. Next up, in the bottom 5, well, we have Lance Stroll in P16. Then we have Zhou Guanyu in P17, Valtteri Bottas P18, Logan in P19, and Nick De Vries in P20. So yes, again, neither of these drivers have been able to, truly escape the bottom 5. Bottas has been impressive in patches. Lance has had a race or two where he has done well, but overall not much to speak of. So yes, these are the cumulative driver rankings. Now, while there are quite a few that would have questions around how Esteban Ocon is in P3 in the overall rankings, well, this is the driver ratings for each and every race. Now you can take a look at this and you can ultimately decide why Esteban Ocon has been able to rise up to P3. It is primarily, in my view, primarily it is because he's not had too many of these off weekends that other drivers have had. And that is where he has gained. Lewis has had his share of off weekends, George Russell as well, Norris and Leclerc too have had weekends where they have not been performing up to the mark. Compare that to Esteban Ocon. On an average, he's done a decent job. There have been a couple of races like the one in Monaco where he truly shined, and that has helped him climb the rankings compared to other drivers. So yes, these are my driver rankings until the first 9 races of the season. What do you guys think? What's your view? Do let me know in the comment section. Thanks for watching and see you next time.